Welcome to a special episode of The Vantage Point. You know, I've been doing the series on surnames and early families in Appalachia and the American South, but I think that sometimes it's important to throw in some historical context, so I'm doing this video separately. And it's about the lead up to the American Revolution and why there was a shot that was heard around the world. I hope you'll join me. It's self-evident to me, at least, that the American Revolution was indeed a full-fledged revolution in every sense of the word. It changed the political and social order in the 13 colonies. The conflict saw battlefield casualties of 6,800 colonial soldiers, plus another 17,000 who died from disease or illness. What's perhaps most reprehensible is that most of the 17,000 who perished did so in British custody. They were poorly housed in prison ships stationed in New York and Boston harbors. In addition, there were 24,000 British military personnel killed. Many tears were shed on both sides of the Atlantic, and no doubt many of the soldiers fighting on both sides were at least distant cousins of each other. A lot of people think that the Declaration of Independence started the hostilities, but it didn't. In case you forgot or never knew, the Declaration was signed on July 4th, 1776. However, there were some major battles and violent put-downs that took place as early as March 5th, 1770, when 7 British soldiers fired into a crowd of protesters that killed 5 colonists, wounded 6 more, and angered the entire colony, as well as providing propaganda fertile soil for the other colonies to join in. That fateful event took place after a few years of pent-up frustration among colonists over restrictions on trade, migration, and new and excessive taxes that included the Currency Act in 1764. This act prohibited the usage of colonial paper currency. With their own currency, the colonies were as independent as they could be in their colonial status. The changes in British policies toward taxing and controlling commerce in the colonies began in the wake of the 7 Years' War, as it was known in Europe, or the French and Indian War, as it was known in the colonies. That conflict ended in 1763 and was the same year that Parliament passed the Proclamation Act to keep colonists from resettling across the Appalachian and Allegheny Mountains. Most immigrants couldn't afford to settle in coastal areas that were, by standards of that day, quite full of people. With increased demand for housing and food, coastal areas promised few opportunities for them, so like mostly the Scots-Irish and other Germanic and other, well, I shouldn't say other Germanic, but Scots-Irish and Germanic peoples who came to America at that time, they landed in places like Philadelphia and Charleston, and many of them spent their last few pounds sterling to buy supplies and perhaps a horse and a cow so they could carve out a homestead on the frontier where they could hunt and cultivate fertile fields and harvest heating and cooking fuel from ample forest lands. They didn't have that over in Britain because it was pretty much denuded. Those opportunities were found in the backcountry of the Piedmont and the Appalachian Mountains. It's important to know that the 7-Year War was also being fought against the French in Europe. It created a massive military bill that doubled England's national debt. To increase England's net income through taxes, Parliament levied taxes on their North American colonies. They tried to justify new taxes by arguing that they were necessary to provide colonial security, especially in the frontier. James Otis Jr., Samuel Adams, and others argued that when Parliament arbitrarily imposed taxes on them and infringed upon their rights, natural rights that is, as Englishmen. Leaders in Boston wanted to control duties on imports without Parliament's approval or interference, and justifiably so. It was their risk, their investment, and their labor. The ensuing fights over taxes and representation of Parliament led to violent outbreaks in the streets between Bostonians and Royal Customs officials. There was some concern among colonial leaders that France and native tribes on the frontier would cause more bloodshed like they did in the French and Indian War. So Parliament used that fear as an excuse to bring in more military personnel, but with no established barracks to house British soldiers or redcoats, Parliament passed the Quartering Act in 1765. The new law ordered the building of barracks, but until they were built, colonists were to house redcoats in privately owned inns, taverns, barns, and even unoccupied homes. There was fear that redcoats would also be forcibly housed in colonial houses that had the families in them, but that was not part of the law. Nonetheless, the Quartering Act expired on March 24, 1767. The colonists took note and resented further taxes, like those imposed by the Stamp Act in 1766. In response to the Stamp Act, Bostonians attacked and destroyed the home of the Royal Stamp Distributor. Parliament then repealed the Stamp Act, and colonial tensions subsided some until further taxes, called the Townshend Acts, were levied on the colonists in 1767. To quell violence, British soldiers occupied Boston starting in 1768. Over the next few years, tensions and control efforts by royal officials increased. By early April 1775, the colonial governor was facing the threat of outright rebellion unleashed by his colonial subjects. The shot heard round the world was fired at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It was fought on April 19, 1775, in small towns in Massachusetts, like Lexington and Concord. The truth of the matter is that few people or societies outside the colonies, England, Ireland, France, Scotland, and Wales, didn't hear the shot or care much about it. It seems that propagandists in every society like to exaggerate their importance as do-gooders or as victims of some form of oppression. The phrase was coined by the writer Ralph Waldo Emerson in his 1837 poem Concord Hymn. At any rate, British forces were sent by Thomas Gage, the relatively new royal governor of Massachusetts. His mission was to seize weapons and stamp out any local resistance to British authority. What he didn't know or consider was that colonists were organized and had developed an efficient line of communication. You might recall that New England, with its restricted growing season and shallow soil, had to rely more on manufacturing and trade than the southern colonies. So punitive tax laws and closing the Boston Harbor hurt them more than, let's say, North Carolina and Georgia, where there was less dependence on trade for food, housing materials, and clothing. Southern colonies were much more self-reliant in an agrarian context during that time, but that distinction would later contribute to the Confederacy's defeat in the Civil War. It was arguably Gage who most stringently enforced the intolerable acts that were also called coercive acts. He was to pay the price in losing the first major battle of the not yet declared War for Independence. As a member of the local militia, handily named the Minutemen, Paul Revere, whose day job was the proprietor of his own silversmithing business, received word on April 18, 1775, that the British Redcoats were coming to Concord. His famous midnight ride alerted other Minutemen to get ready for a fight. Having learned to fight like American Indians, militiamen hid or took shelter behind trees, rocks, and other obstructions, and despite the British firing the first shots, the Minutemen struck the bold Redcoats with surprising ferocity. Gage's forces lost the day, but colonial America went on to endure 8 years of bloodshed in its war on its path to independence. Now, was it worth it? I think so. The legacy of America, despite the screeds of socialists and communists that make up a large part of today's college faculties, includes promoting concepts like equality before the law and economic prosperity around the world. It took a couple of hundred years, but America has led the effort to raise the Earth's population out of destitution, even if some of us don't appreciate it. America has been a blessing to the world, and for that, I'm thankful and grateful. Thanks for joining me today here on The Vantage Point. God bless you and yours. Bye-bye.